time with you this morning. Some exciting talks, and over the course of the next 2 days, a lot to enjoy, everyone.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Okay, so now we get to our main program. I would encourage all of you on the side to please come on in and grab a seat. There's lots of seats up here at the front. So the theme of this conference is bringing science to the stable. And over the next few days, we will reminisce over the beginnings of our relationships with horses, examine where we have progressed in terms of equitation science, and explore where the future might take us. I'm very pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker of the conference, Dr. Sandra Olsen. Dr. Olsen is a professor at the University of Kansas and a curator in charge for the Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum. She is a renowned scientist and zoo archaeologist who has explored and documented the earliest domestication of the horse and challenged our knowledge of our wild ancestors of the modern Atlas. Dr. Olsen, before you share some of your stories with us, I would just like to remind the audience that this presentation is being live streamed and made available to ISIS members who are unable to attend in person. So Dr. Olsen, just fire you up.
Can you all hear me? Everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Well, the first thing I want to do is to thank the organizers and the volunteers and everyone who's made this possible. I was just telling somebody a few minutes ago that this is the best organized conference I've ever been at. It's just been incredible. And over the last year, they've been communicating with me regularly to make sure that everything fell in line. From my point of view, I don't think I've ever been treated as well as I have been here. But that doesn't surprise me because I've actually been a part of the equine industry online course, very beautifully organized by Gail Eckert and others, and for 8 years, we think. So I've had an ongoing relationship with Wealth, and I hope to even ramp that up a bit. It's just been an incredible experience. So the first thing I have to do is put in a qualifier because I hope you all will understand I'm an archaeologist and I'm not really an expert from the living horse point of view. I study their bones and I study the archaeological evidence, but I have been at it since about 1985, and it's my favorite subject. So with that in mind, I know I'm talking to a very expert audience, and so it may make me a little nervous at times, but hopefully you'll forgive me if I say something silly. Okay. First thing I have to do is figure out how this works. Okay. All right. So, of course, the relationship between horses and humans is very complex. And even from very early on, you'll see that we have a number of different roles that the horse played in our lives. And I think you all would agree with me that if we had to try to imagine to extract the horse from human history, it would be an impossible feat. The horse has been so essential to us all through time. And I'm going to just talk about the early history, realizing that I'm leaving a huge amount out and everything, certainly from the Iron Age on. So but I thought this would be a topic that maybe you may not have that much familiarity with. So yes, as you can see by this list, which is not 100% comprehensive, the horses have played many major roles in human society for a long time. So I want to talk just a little bit about how we have shaped horses and how horses have shaped us. I think the latter is underestimated very often. But for horses, of course, once we developed all of these breeds, there was enormous variation. There is enormous variation in size and in morphology, conformation, the way they look, and the way they act and their strengths or various processes like work and so forth. So we have shaped horses in a big way, but and we've had an impact on them. I'll go through some of these in my lecture. We began 3.6 million years ago sharing the same environment with them. Then we switched to having kind of a predator-prey relationship, and I apologize, I love horses too, but it's part of our history, to domestication, breed development, and then expanding the horse's roles, which we still continue to do today. I'm sure you've all had this question about where do we go next? How do we utilize the many aspects of horses' strengths in the future? And then, of course, there's the expansion of the horse's geographic range, which I'm very interested in as an archaeologist. Okay, so I'm going to go way, way, way back to the very beginning, or so we think. It may even be earlier than this. But at the site of Baitoli in Tanzania, there are footprints that have been preserved from 3.66 million years ago in the ash. And they represent a number of animals, as you can see, as well as very early hominids. And one of those animals happens to have been the equihipparian. Okay, so this was the earliest record we have of humans and horses sharing the environment. Of course, I'm sure we go back even earlier. We think that the hominids were Australopithecus afarensis, although it's kind of hard to tell, and all you have is footprints, but based on what was in the area at the time. They were discovered by the famous archaeologist Mary Leakey, Louis Leakey's wife, in 1976. And those hominid tracks proved that even by that early date, people were walking upright, they were bipedal. One group of footprints was done by 3 individuals who were strolling along at a very normal human walking gait. Okay, in addition to that, there were footprints of 3 hipparians, 2 adults and 1 juvenile, and they were crisscrossing as juveniles and mares do today at a running gait. So members of the hipparian genus had 3 toes, but the weight was just on that 3rd digit, as our modern horses do, and then there were 2 vestigial toes, the digits 2 and 4. They stood about 14 hands, and they basically resembled modern horses except for those little extra toes. So, in the beginning of hominid history, these omnivorous individuals would have wanted to consume meat as well as plants. However, they didn't really have the proper equipment for hunting. That came along later. So their first tools were basically little flakes and cores made of stone, and not really suitable for killing animals. So what we believe is that they scavenged, much like vultures, hyenas, other animals, carcasses that were killed by lions and other predators. Okay, so we have some evidence for this in terms of scavenging equid meat, and we can easily imagine that in the African savannas today with zebras, for example. In the Mori Formation in Ethiopia, discoveries show that about 2.5 million years ago, the Australopithecines used stone tools to butcher hipparian and wildebeest carcasses and crack open the bones to extract fatty marrow inside. Marrow is very important for nutrition for early hominids and even later in time. Okay, then a big transition happened as we had the development of weapons that could be used for hunting, and that was a pivotal moment in human history. We have an amazing site in Schöningen, Germany, where it's actually rather hard for archaeologists to believe this. 8 wooden spears were preserved that are 300,000 years old. This is incredible discovery. And they were associated with 20 horses of Equus Mosbachen incense. And this was like the earliest horse kill site that we know of. Okay, so I actually got started working on the horse-human relationship back in 1985 when I went to the site of Solutre, which is a beautiful site nestled in the Puy-Puissé vineyards. French Paleolithic archaeologists kind of have it made, in my opinion, so not half bad. It's near the city of Mâcon, and it is the largest accumulation of bones that were hunted by horses in the world. It's a pretty amazing story for continuity because these modern humans were doing the same practice for 20,000 years. And so that led to this enormous accumulation of 9-meter deep, very concentrated horse bones, estimated roughly to 60 to 100,000 horses were killed, but over a period of 20,000 years. So back in the 1800s, a geographer named Arsalan came up with a theory that, like the bison jumps in North America, which you have right here in Canada, that the horses were driven up this kind of ramp and then off the precipice. Unfortunately, the site was not there. The site is where the little arrow is over to the side. And so you wouldn't have to drag all those carcasses that were there, and the question is why. So I studied the geography and I studied horse behavior and particularly wild and feral horses, and came up with the theory that they were doing an annual migration every year from the Saône River Valley, where they would winter, up into the Massif Central, where they would go to spring pastures. And in this process of going through this narrow valley, the humans would deflect them into a cul-de-sac against the cliff face and then dispatch them with spears. So that kind of got me started thinking about horse behavior and this relationship at a time when there was a predator-prey relationship between humans and horses. Then I got very interested in what we could learn from very early art because I thought there was a lot of information encoded in that. And my main thing is studying animal bones, but you can't help but get excited about this French and Spanish Paleolithic art when you see it. So I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of the caves and then to look at some of the small art mobilier as well. So what I found is that these artists were incredibly talented and could express a lot of activities and understanding of the animals that they were hunting between 35,000 and 12,000 years ago. Oh, and there was what we see not always but very frequently is depictions of spears with fletching on them being hurled at the animals. So we think that most rock art, and I study Saudi Arabian rock art as well, most rock art has a kind of spiritual connection. So we think that this may indicate not just that people were hunting these animals, but that perhaps creating these images would kind of be hunting magic to facilitate their success rate. But we can also see some indications of animal behavior depicted in some of these, the little mobile art as well as the paintings. And here's an example that's unusual. It's the only case I know of at this early date of showing a horse with a very arched neck. You could probably interpret this in many ways, but perhaps it's just a suggestion of, natural horse behavior where two stallions are competing, challenging each other. And this is a very tiny little sculpture. It's beautiful, just 4.2 centimeters in length, and is the oldest depiction of a horse. Okay, one of my colleagues has suggested that possibly this little horse head represented a horse that was, it's hard to say to narrow it down, but was maybe startled because the mouth is open, as though it was caught in the middle of some kind of vocalization. Its eyes are bulging, and its ears are pricked, and the head is thrown back. So I leave it to you experts to interpret what that means. But what's interesting to me is that the Paleolithic artist found it useful to show these facial expressions and body language of the animals. And of course, if you're a hunter, it helps you to anticipate the next move that the animal is going to make. And so I think it's quite natural that these hunters would have a really thorough understanding of the animals they were hunting, and it's nice to see that expressed in the art. Okay. One of my favorite painted caves is Neo, which is in the French Pyrenees, and you have to walk down a 100-meter long narrow corridor, and at the end is a beautiful big rotunda. It's not as big as this, but it's good size. And there are all these animals painted on the walls. It's incredible. And they're shaggier. All the animals are shaggier than you normally see in the paintings. So I think probably because this was a very secluded, warm place to be in the winter during the Ice Age, that probably the Paleolithic people were kind of hanging out there and, drawing what they were seeing at the time. So it's maybe a winter scene. Okay, so we see all kinds of realistic features in these animals. The dun coat, not too surprising since they're wild equids, was the most common. And in it we can see a lot of different characteristics that is typical of a wild equid. So an erect mane, a dun coat, zebra striping on the legs, and so forth. So the wither striping is a little extreme over here. At Lascaux, the Lascaux artists were quite flamboyant, but we do see a lot of wither striping, and that's not too surprising on a wild equid. We also see the best example of this zebra striping at Tito Bustillo in Spain. I just saw this a year ago. It's incredible. It's open to the public, so northern Spain if you get the opportunity. So we can see a lot of these details that help us understand what the animals look like. Now, before they started doing a lot of ancient DNA, this was our best evidence for coat colors. So now with the DNA, they can tell me all kinds of things. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how the mane is depicted with two colors, with the dark at the top and then the lighter. And there again, we can see this in wild equids, like the African wild ass, and in the fjord horse. And what that indicates is that there's an eel stripe, which is sometimes hard to see on in the pictures, but that's an indication that it's there. And of course, a mealy muzzle, which goes with the dun coat, is often depicted. And that just shows that the muzzle's a lighter color, just like in the Przewalski horse. But what is a little bit surprising to me, I didn't necessarily believe the artists until the DNA experts proved that the artists were actually quite accurate, is that you can see some variation off of that dun. You can see black and bay and brown colored horses. And the DNA is supporting that, actually, that there was more of a range of colors than you would expect for wild animals. That's not what we typically see in wild animals. So the DNA experts have actually found both black and bay coats in their analysis. Okay, so there has been one example of a study that was done by Hopper and Munch that analyzed 31 ancient horses from Europe and Siberia, going back as far as 35,000 years ago. And that's really pushing the envelope on a lot of this DNA. It's phenomenal what they can do today. And they found that 6 animals had the leopard spotting gene, that shows up particularly in dappled horses. So this is a beautiful cave you can visit too, the Peshmeral, and everybody talked about how there were spotted horses there, and they kind of look dappled. But if you look a little closer, you'll see that those spots go outside the bodies of both horses. And so, why were they doing this? The only example of this, we don't really understand. So that made me skeptical about whether these were really supposed to be spotted horses, because they use a variety of techniques to sort of spray red on various animals to depict wounds. And you will see some red there too. But even the red spots in this case extend outside the body. So it's kind of weird, but now we do know that there were spotted horses occasionally, based on the DNA. We do see some examples of groups of horses, and that's not too surprising since the horses would have been moving around in harems or bands. So that's just yet another expression of the artist noticing how animals move. And the one at Lascaux in France, very interesting because it shows multicolored horses, so they're different individuals, and going along in single file, as horses will do. This is one that I don't think anybody else has noticed, and I'm looking for more examples now at the famous cave of Chauvet, again in France. There's an example of wounds that look like claw marks, perhaps from a cave bear or a lion. They're long streaks of red, and cave bears are depicted right there at Chauvet, and you can see claw marks in the cave and sleeping hollows and that sort of thing. So a lot of times these enormous cave bears would be up to 10 feet tall, bigger than Kodiak bears, much bigger, would occupy the cave, and then the humans would occupy them, and the cave bears, and so it's kind of scary. I don't know if the humans drove them out or what, but so there's a possibility that they, witnessed a horse being attacked by a carnivore. And we see depictions of hyenas and cave lions, as well as finding their bones in the archaeological deposits. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears from that predator-prey relationship to one of domestication of the horse, and that's something I've spent many years studying. So I just wanted to give you this quick little quote by Darwin, who we keep coming back to over and over again, paleontologists and archaeologists, and it's amazing what he knew at the time when he lived. So he said about artificial selection, although man does not cause variability and cannot even prevent it, he can select, preserve, and accumulate the variations given to him by the hand of nature almost in any way which he chooses, and thus he can certainly produce a great result. And he published this in The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication back in 1868. And he spent a lot of time talking about horses, which I can't get into right now, but it's very interesting. So in 1993, about 18 months after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I was able to go into Kazakhstan, which is just west of China, south of Siberia, it's in Central Asia, and visit an amazing site called Batai. And the Batai culture lived about 3,500 BCE, or 5,500 years ago. And when I visited that site and saw a collection of 300,000 horse bones in the lab, I was convinced that was the place to go look for early domestication for many reasons. The timing was just about right, because after that we started to see horses moving outside their natural range, and some things indicating they were domesticated. This is unparalleled anywhere else, even in the Eurasian steppes. 90 to 95% of the animal bones from the archaeological sites that belong to the Batai culture were horse. That's really monocropping in a way that you just don't see except at something like Solutrecht Hill site. So to see this in a big village of like 160 houses where people were permanent, living there year-round, is phenomenal, because they couldn't have been hunting wild horses to any extent, because they would have depleted the population so quickly around the village, and then they would have had to go farther and farther on foot and drag the carcasses back. So to me, this said they must have had livestock right there in the village. We looked very hard with a paleobotanist for any evidence of agriculture, and there is none. So it's the only explanation. But then we decided we had to find more proof. And I won't go into this, but just to show you that I really believe in the holistic approach, and we just kind of went at it in every way possible. We looked at the teeth, the bones, the chemistry of the soil, the artifacts. We looked at art, not so much from Bataille, but other areas. The site itself, and how it had all these, houses and corrals and so forth. Looked at some human remains. We were looking for writing facets on the femora, and then ancient DNA. And I'll get into some of these examples. Okay, so I'm just going to take it through the different lines of evidence. So starting with the dental remains, what did we learn from them? Robin Bendry, my colleague, has done some exciting work and has found examples of a polish on the mesial edge of the lower second premolar, which is where you look for wear relating to some kind of bridle. We think they probably had just a very simple war bridle or long bridle, and that would explain that kind of wear. If we look at their mortality patterns in terms of culling, they were culling almost a fifth of the animals before, or about the time they reached sexual maturity at 3.5 years, way before that. They only lived to be about 8 years, some of them up to 12 years. And we don't see a selection. It's a little tricky in the archaeological record, but we don't see a selection of culling for males. We see a lot of adult males in ceremonial burials. We think they were keeping them for herding and for other purposes, and writing. So if we look at the skeletal remains, we can do quite a lot with them. We know we can estimate the height, and they stood about 13 hands. They were very healthy. They had few pathologies, and I think by the time the pathologies show up in the bones, it's time to have them for dinner. So they were probably slaughtering any that showed any kind of weaknesses. They were raised for food. We know this because of the butcher marks made with stone tools on the bones. There were lots of artifacts made out of bones, and I'll get into the one that you see here, this thong smoother for straightening rawhide thongs. And they had head and neck burials, and these show up in Mongolia and later sites too. This particular one is facing northeast, but most of them face southeast, which is because they were facing the sun, the rising sun, and most horses in the Eurasian steppes were slaughtered in the late fall, so they could be frozen through the winter. Okay, and what do we know from pottery? The pottery is not very impressive there if you look at it. It's what we lovingly call crudware. It's little pieces of black or gray, but it has impressions in it of cloth and basketry and that sort of thing. They're quite interesting through the summer and then as late into the fall as they can. One of the archaeological techniques we used was remote sensing, which allows you to map in all of the structures in the site, even down to fairly small post holes, without digging. Now, we did dig, but you couldn't dig the whole site. And so we used a magnetometer, which you see Ivy walking along with, and we had incredible results. These large dark squares are all pit houses. They're dug down about 1 meter. And the smaller ones are either pits, storage pits, sacrificial animal pits, and then some very fine holes that, if you look in this area, you can see this circle. Those are post holes that represent a fence. And so we decided that had a lot of promise, but there are other alignments around as well. we thought this could be a corral. So we will do some testing of the soil. And we did, oh dear. Okay. Oh, okay. So we had geologist Mike Rosenmeyer come out, and everywhere you see a number, he took a soil test along these transects, and then he also tested outside the site itself. And what he found was that we had very escalated levels of phosphorus, which we assume represents manure, and sodium, which probably represented urine. So my colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, Rosemary Capo, and her students did this analysis. And the thing is, we had so many horses represented and only possibly one or two domestic cattle. We're still investigating that. So we're pretty sure that these are horse corrals. We also had my colleague Charlie French at Cambridge University do soil micromorphology on the collapsed roofs from these pit houses, and you can see what they look like when they collapse. This is kind of reconstruction of the house. And the way we interpreted what he found, which is horse manure in the roofing material, is that you can look around today and you can see manure used as an insulation, particularly today on outbuildings, in Kazakhstan and Mongolia. And so manure is a very, very important resource for pastoralists because they use it for fuel, and we found some of that in the fireplaces and the hearths, but also they use it for insulation. And so, of course, if you had all these horses in corrals right there, you have a ready source of manure. But the DNA has been the real shocker, and Ludovic Orlando and his team, an enormous number of people, have been working on ancient DNA of the Bataille horses. And I have to say, and I'm apologizing for the results, but it's science. What can I say? It's very convincing. I was caught off guard when it turns out that our domestic horses, which are still the earliest in the world, did not give rise to those 350 breeds. That was a big disappointment for me. Instead, they gave rise to the Chervalsky wild Mongolian horses. And it's sad because the conservation biologists were kind of thrown off because they can no longer say they're trying to, preserve the only wild equid that's still alive today. But I think the Chervalskys are very interesting because they represent the descendants of the first, as far as we know today, the first case of domestication. Now, of course, now we have to look for a second center, and there may be a third and fourth. We're finding out that a lot of animals were domesticated multiple times. So the other thing that was really interesting for me is most of the Bataille horses were dun coats, which is not surprising when you look at the Chervalsky, but at least one individual was heterozygous for 4 mutations at the locus that is associated with leopard spotting. Ludovic Orlando interprets that as maybe that horse had kind of an Appaloosa coat with some limited spotting. So according to the DNA experts, and I would totally agree with this, the most important thing in our line of work that we need to do is the focus of future archaeological and genetic work must be on identifying the main source of the domestic horse stock, both geographically and temporally, and investigating how the multiple human cultures manage the available genetic variation to engineer the many types or breeds of horses known in history. So we have some clues about that. It could be Ukraine, it could be Western Russia. That's where I would look first for that, because that's where you see the Yamnaya culture spreading out with horses not too long after that, about 3000 BC. Okay, so I feel pretty confident that the Bataille were riding horses. They were milking them, so I think it's not too scary to think of them as a lot of my archaeological colleagues think, oh, that would just be too terrifying to get on a horse that's only been recently domesticated. But they were controlling them in so many ways, including milking them. I don't have a problem with that. Plus, Robin Bindry's examples of wear on the lower premolar suggest a thong bridle. They had to have a way of controlling those horses out on the open steppe. And we watch the Kazakh with their herds all the time. And I can't imagine that you just turn these recently domesticated horses out without having a way of bringing them back to a corral. So these interesting tools are the most common bone artifacts in the Thai culture, and they are what we call thong smoothers, which ends up being sort of humorous today, but they were used for taking rawhide strips and stretching them and straightening them. And you can use rawhide for lots of things. The Inuit use rawhide thongs for lots of different things. But you know, for horses, you could use them for like a thong bridle, a hobble, a pole snare, whips, riding crops, various things. They didn't have stirrups, they didn't have saddles, but still you could use them for control. But it was very slow in finding any kind of depictions of riding in the art, which is kind of surprising to me, but the Batai didn't do much in the way of art. And other cultures didn't either until quite late. The earliest example I know of is around 2100 BCE in Mesopotamia, which was kind of a secondary area for horses and for riding especially. This particular little effigy, you can't see it in this photograph, but he has a long flowing mane. We know it's not a donkey. So that's the earliest example. But then riding continued on, I'm sure, all the way through from Batai onward. But it was kind of overshadowed in history and art and various kinds of evidence by the chariot. When the chariot came along, even earlier than 2000, but the earliest evidence we have of actual buried chariots comes from Russia and Kazakhstan, but these are pretty sophisticated. They wouldn't have been the earliest ones. They became very successful for building great empires like the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Egyptian empires. And so they got depicted in art, and they were buried with their horses and the people a lot. They served as a mobile archery platform. And their real peak of when they were being built by these organized civilizations was around 1300 to 900 BCE. And they did persist later on into Byzantine times for royal processions associated with the king, for example, hunts and sports up until about 532 CE. But then really what happens is about 900 BCE, we see the cavalry just take off and basically replace chariot warfare. And it makes a lot of sense because if you're traveling in rough terrain, you can't even easily cross a stream with a chariot. You can't go up in the mountains. The Greeks, for example, they had to carry their chariots up in the mountains. So the horses were much more capable of handling that terrain. Plus, you don't have to have the manufacturing that goes on with chariots. And experimental replication of chariots have shown it's actually really hard to make a good chariot. So it's easier just to have these horses and cavalrymen. So that really took off and still persists even today. So I'll just talk a little bit about the development of tack, which you all know you don't really need that much tack, but it's something that we did develop to kind of improve things along the way. After the thong bridle and some organic mouthpieces, they started developing a bar mouthpiece, which appeared about 2000 BCE and associated with chariots. A lot of those cheek pieces on those bits had studs on the inside to apply pressure, like you see with a run-out bit. And so they were associated with chariots rather than riding, most likely. The most elaborate ones were these ones from Luristan, Iran. They're incredible. So the cheek pieces look like horses and with manned riding. Snaffle bits look just exactly like our modern snaffle bits, showed up around 900 BCE and just kept on building. And they were associated right at the same time with the cavalry. Okay, so they were using these bar bits more with chariots, and they then switched over to snaffle when they went to cavalries. Saddles were not really that essential for a long time. You could have cavalries quite successful without any kind of saddle, but they did start to be developed about the time that cavalries became popular. And the earliest ones that are preserved, because they're very fragile, they're perishable, have come from Xinjiang in northwest China, where you find these incredibly well-preserved mummies too, in a very dry environment. Stirrups are rather late development. The earliest indications we have are in India, about 187 BCE, where it was just a loop of some kind of organic material, either something like hemp or rope or rawhide. Stirrups were probably first developed just to help to mount the horse and just on one side, but then they started using them the way we do today. So they went through kind of evolution. They were fairly late and they weren't used. Attila the Hun was one of the first empire builders to actually use that to a great advantage. And spurs were also really late to appear. They appeared around the 3rd century BCE, but Herodotus was already mentioning them in the 4th century BCE. So they, again, they were one of these things that wasn't essential, but maybe gave you some advantage. So just in closing, I thought, I'm leaving out a whole lot, and I'm stopping fairly early because there's just not enough time to cover everything, and you probably know more about medieval times than I do. I want to talk about the value of the horse, and of course, from a very practical standpoint, you can see that people ate horses, drank their milk, used them for all kinds of work, which I haven't really gotten into, for riding and draft, various kinds of transportation, for warfare, and then sports and various things. And the modern end of it, how we value horses now as companions. And so things have improved for horses from their point of view, I'm sure. So we have this ever-increasing range of uses. And for many cultures, horses have been indispensable through time. And they have been linked to kings, to royalty, nobility, and they are a great source of status even today, that's true. They were associated with deities, especially the great sun god, which was found all over the Eurasian steppes and the Indo-European diaspora. Ownership gives you a measure of wealth. In many cultures, they were used as gifts, taxation, for dowries, for bride price, all sorts of things. So they were used as a commodity. And they were adorned in many ways. And so they trimmed the mane, and they did special things with the tail, and they put these beautiful plumes on them like Tutankhamun did his chariot horses. They really decked them out to look spectacular because they were very proud of them and because of all the high status that was associated with them. But more to the point, what we think about today, which I think is long overdue for horses, is to talk about equine welfare. And it was dependent on many, many things in addition to what I put up here. But it depends on the role the horse plays in society. And that gets back to how it's valued, whether that's economical or for transportation, whatever. It also depends on the society's compassion for animals, which I think has grown enormously in the last 100 years, and the value and the status of the horses. It also depends on the existing conditions in society. So whether that society is at war or peace, we still use U.S. cavalry, or did recently, in Afghanistan, for example. So whether a country is at war, you can think about equine welfare more easily and invest more in it when you're at peace. Whether the country is primarily poor or has a reasonable middle class, whether it's underdeveloped or developed. So all of these things impact equine welfare, and that's true all through time. But I think we're now at the stage where horses are in a lot better shape than they were a few thousand years ago. And of course, I just wanted to finish with this. People ask me, as I said, what is the future of the horse? What new roles will be added? And I leave that to you to decide. But I think one of the most exciting fields that's growing now is equine-assisted therapy. And that shows, I think, kind of the culmination of our valuing horses for all the things they can contribute to us. My mentor for many years was Mary Littauer, who was the world's authority on the horse in classical archaeology in ancient times. And so I just wanted to acknowledge, in addition to all of the people who put together this wonderful conference, to all of our mentors who inspired and trained us, and to all of our students, that they might be encouraged and will inspire future generations. And I like this quote by Michelle Obama. We've got a responsibility to live up to the legacy of those who came before us by doing all that we can to help those who come
That you please raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you by one of our volunteers. This is important also for the live stream so that everyone can hear. And please introduce yourself and state where you are from.
Hello, my name is Angelo Telatin, Delaware Valley University. I always was wondering, and I couldn't make up my mind on that one. So the DNA tell us that they were different from the Przewalski for the two extra genes, so that could suggest a breeding origins because we didn't mix them. But then the mitochondrial DNA tell us that instead we can pinpoint like the cows, like a narrow origin of animals. So we got animals from the wild, multiple animals enter into the stock, and we invented first the domestication. Instead of the breeding, the training, and then the training spread among the human culture. Makes sense what I'm trying to say?
I think that the Przewalski question, at first it threw me because I actually published back in 2000, I think, that we had some evidence for hunting as well. It's a very small bit of evidence. There's just like some wounds in, it doesn't even necessarily mean the animal was wild, but some wounds from harpoons that were used on land. And I'd always thought that there had to be some wild horses there in the Bataille area. They hunted a few other animals like moose and red deer and side antelope. So I'm sure there were some wild horses in the Bataille area at the time. So back to this, Orlando didn't believe his own evidence for a year. It was so shocking to him, but he wanted to really make sure he was right on this, and he's excellent. He's one of the leading people in the field. So basically what it looks like is that the Przewalski is embedded in the range of variation for the Bataille horses and the later Orly horses, whereas the modern breeds shown over here, the ancient domestic ones, which we have not identified yet, probably in Ukraine or Western Russia, and then the modern domestic ones are pretty separated. And I didn't have time to get into this, but the ancient humans from Bataille were very isolated from the Europeans. And so it looks as though there was not a lot of communication between the Batai people, who are Asian, and the Europeans to the west. But then soon after that, you have the Yamnaya people coming from the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea and moving into the Batai area. The Batai either moved over into Mongolia or disappeared, or combined with those Indo-Europeans. So I don't think it's all been sorted out, but I do think it's pretty clear. And it took me a while to really accept it. But I think Ludovic was pretty thorough in interpreting it. So it's disappointing, but yeah.
Hi there, I'm Netsine Steckless from the University of Arizona. I just spent all last summer going to all those caves, looking at that art. Amazing, although you gave me some new ones that I need to go back to. But my question was about the depiction of horses, and especially in these caves where they suspected, from what I understood from the folks that I visited, that it wasn't so much depicting the animals they hunted, because at many of the caves, the animals that they ate from the bone marks were not the ones depicted in the caves at those particular sites. Did you ever hear that kind of idea, that it's not a picture of your lunch menu, but rather it plays a different role? Did you get that impression, or what's your thinking on that?
Okay, so archaeologists have looked at the frequencies of the animal bones that are deposited in those very caves and compared them with the frequencies of the animals depicted. And I would say they probably weren't consuming the carnivores like the cave lion and the cave bear. They might, well, the cave bear they might have been. So those were depicted for other reasons, because they were threats. But what we do see is they were mostly consuming reindeer. And reindeer are depicted, but at a much lower percentage than something like a mammoth or an ibex even. And so archaeologists have interpreted that as the more dangerous an animal is to hunt, the more likely it is to be portrayed. And reindeer were not particularly dangerous. When they forded a stream, they were able to kill them pretty easily. So even though they were the most frequently eaten, they were less frequently depicted, but actually almost all of the animals that are depicted were eaten. Their bones show up with cut marks on them in the deposits. So, but that's not to say they didn't have ceremonial associations. We see that with the domestic horses. We see it with wild animals all the time. So it's the relationship between the animals that were the prey and the humans. It's very complicated. For example, most totem animals in North American tribes were ones that were hunted. And so there's a lot of ceremonial religious beliefs associated with the very animals that they hunted. So, so being a zooarchaeologist, and I have studied the faunal material from those sites, I would say the people would eat just about any of those things that were depicted, yeah. But they probably also had all kinds of religious beliefs associated as well. And they would be using them for the hides, for the bones, for the tendons, to make sinew thread. Everything they could use out of those animals, they would thoroughly exploit them. Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Nat Warren. I'm from New Zealand. Just thank you very, very much for a wonderful talk and a great journey that you've taken us on, and the passion, obviously, that you bring to this. It really came across in your talk, so thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you about bits and the bitware that you were seeing on the teeth of those horses. And whether or not you were able to age some of those horses and give us an indication of when you saw the earliest use of the bit in the horse's mouth in terms of the age of the individuals. So was there any information from that came across?
That I think, on permanent teeth. It wasn't, my study was after I stopped going over there. Robin's been over there more recently. David Anthony has claimed that there are 5 other examples of wear on the occlusal surface, and they were all adult teeth as well, permanent. Those are, I have questioned those, as to how reliable they are. Maybe a couple of those are reliable. But, so it would be after the permanent teeth come in. So I would imagine they would be writing probably from age 3 on. But the reason we don't see a lot of wear, I'm convinced, is because if you look at modern day pastoralists, only in the Bataille area they had a herd of 250 horses that they rode past Bataille every day, every single day, and that they drove through. And there were only 2 herders. So out of that 250 horses, only 2 were ever bitted. And the others were raised basically like cattle in the sense they were livestock. They were raised for dairy and for meat production. And they, of course, didn't have any shoes. They didn't ever wear a bridle or anything like that. And so I think that's why we see very, very little wear on the second premolars, because you think you're only going to have a couple to manage that whole big herd. And so, but that's a great question. I'll keep that in mind. But I would imagine it would be after they got their permanent second premolar erupted. So, okay. Yes. Oh, you need a microphone. Sorry.
Thank you. Malcolm Campbell, University of Guelph. Thank you, Dr. Olsen, for an excellent seminar. It was absolutely fantastic. My question is also related to TAC. I was rather struck by the mastazile vocalizing horse deer antler carving. And that head and that mastazile carving comes from 15,000 years ago. And it was easy to imagine that looking at it, it looked like, at least artistically rendered, there had been something that looked like a halter. And yet, that sort of tack didn't emerge for another 10 millennia. Is it possible that there was, I'll call it handling tack as opposed to riding tack, that was emergent even in those Stone Age people?
This has Paul Bond, who has published a lot on the Paleolithic art, has suggested that. And so I've actually looked at the coat patterns when you have this dun coat, and I mentioned the mealy muzzle, and there's another thing that you'll see, and that is the line where the cheek teeth are. You know, the horses can kind of, you can sort of see that ridge or that line in many of these. And so Paul Bond thought that they were wearing halters, but you could in fact overlay a Trabowski head on top of a lot of these, and you would see that it's the mealy muzzle, and it's where the masseter muscle is, and that sort of thing. It does look like a halter when it's not in color, and there are little lines depicted. And it turns out that it's actually just kind of the way the natural coloration is for the dun coat. But that's a really good question, and yeah, it has, that has been brought up.
Last question.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but one more.
Andrew McLean from Australia. Thank you so much. That was so enjoyable. Your talk was excellent. I have one question that leads on from Natalie's question and also one of the others about tack, and that is that, do you consider that maybe it's quite a presumption to think that riding began with putting a bit in the mouth, or do you think that maybe riding predated what we see in bit wear, because it's certainly possible to ride horses without a bit, and other animals like elephants and camels are ridden without a bit. So could it be that we were riding horses long before that anyway, and there was quite a big leap of faith to be thinking you should put something in an animal's mouth.
I like that way of thinking because so archaeologists have certain ways of defining domestication, and we exclude elephants from saying they're domesticated. And yet, elephant trainers, people ride elephants all the time. Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. I've heard a lot of really good explanations from equestrians as to how you would first tame a horse, and you start with a foal perhaps, and usually women are given the credit for it. I wish we could prove these things, but now DNA is telling us all kinds of things I didn't think we could prove. Riding is one of the hardest things to prove. It's frustrating for me. There has to be a way we can get at this, besides a little bit of where we've seen the teeth. We don't see any kind of pathologies on the back. Marshall Levine looked for that. It wasn't, riding bareback was not really causing pathologies. So, I think that we need to keep a more open mind, and I would agree with you that that could easily be the case. And I wish we had more definitive proof for riding, but maybe in the future someone will figure that out. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, I better quit now and give other people a chance to talk. But thank you all